I had been the chief operating officer of Pinnacle Systems for 3 years when the company hired Trevor Ashford as the new CEO, and within 6 weeks of his arrival, I understood that he had been brought in specifically to push me out while maintaining the appearance of an orderly executive transition. Pinnacle was a mid-sized enterprise software company based in Seattle with about 900 employees and $420 million in annual revenue, specializing in supply chain optimization platforms for manufacturing and logistics companies. And I had been responsible for building the operational infrastructure that had allowed the company to scale from $180 million to its current size over a period of 5 years. The board had hired Trevor from a larger competitor where he had held the title of Chief Revenue Officer, and they had been impressed by his track record of aggressive growth, his polished presentation style, and his confidence in articulating a vision for how Pinnacle could accelerate its market expansion and position itself for either an IPO or a strategic acquisition within 18 months. What the board did not understand, because they had not done the operational due diligence that would have revealed it, was that Trevor's previous company had grown revenue through accounting maneuvers and channel stuffing rather than sustainable customer acquisition. Trevor's strategy for establishing himself as the dominant executive presence was straightforward and methodical. He would systematically exclude me from decision-making processes, take credit for operational successes that my team had delivered, and position me as a legacy leader who lacked the vision and aggressiveness required for the company's next phase of growth. The exclusion started subtly during his first month, with small changes to meeting structures that seemed reasonable on the surface but had the cumulative effect of reducing my visibility and influence. He created a new executive leadership team meeting that occurred before the regular executive committee meetings I had been running for 2 years, and he structured this new meeting as a strategic forum that included himself, the CFO, the Chief Revenue Officer, and the Chief Product Officer, but not me. When I asked about the purpose of this additional meeting layer, Trevor explained that he wanted to create a space for forward-looking strategic discussions that were not constrained by operational details, and that he valued my operational leadership, but needed his direct reports to think more strategically about growth initiatives before operational feasibility became the focus of discussion. The implication was clear. My presence in strategic conversations would introduce operational concerns that would slow down the bold thinking he wanted to encourage, and therefore the best way to enable that thinking was to exclude me from the room where it happened. Over the next 3 months, the pattern intensified. Trevor stopped inviting me to board meetings, telling the board that he wanted to streamline executive presentations and that he would represent operational matters on my behalf. He restructured the reporting lines so that the heads of customer success, professional services, and technical operations now reported directly to him rather than through me, effectively removing 3/4 of my organizational responsibility while leaving my title unchanged. He created a new strategic planning process that he personally controlled, with working groups that included mid-level managers from my former teams but not me, and he positioned these working groups as the innovation engine of the company, the place where the real future of Pinnacle was being designed. And he began making operational decisions without consulting me, decisions about resource allocation, headcount, technology investments, and process changes. And when these decisions created problems that my remaining team had to solve, he would express surprise that I had not anticipated the issues and prevented them proactively. The message he was sending to the organization was unmistakable. The COO role was being quietly deprecated, and I was being repositioned as a caretaker of legacy systems rather than a builder of the company's future. The board seemed unaware of this dynamic, or perhaps they were aware and had tacitly approved it as part of the CEO transition they had initiated by hiring Trevor. I had built relationships with several board members over the years, including the chair of the audit committee and one of the independent directors who had operational experience in enterprise software. But Trevor controlled the information flow to the board, and his narrative about the company's trajectory was compelling enough that they appeared satisfied with his leadership. The quarterly board meetings where I had previously presented detailed operational metrics and strategic initiatives now featured Trevor delivering high-level growth narratives with limited operational detail. And when board members asked questions about execution risks or operational constraints, Trevor would acknowledge the concerns and say that his team was managing those details, while he focused on the strategic opportunities that would drive transformational growth. I was present in the room for these presentations, but I was not presenting, and the board's questions were directed to Trevor rather than to me, and I understood that my role had been effectively reduced to silent observer of my own diminishment. The turning point came during a board meeting in late September when Trevor presented a plan to accelerate the company's growth through an aggressive customer acquisition strategy that would require significant increases in sales and marketing spending, expansion of the sales team by 40%, and a shift in product positioning toward larger enterprise deals that would have longer sales cycles but higher contract values. The plan was ambitious and the financial projections were impressive, showing a path to $600 million in revenue within 18 months and positioning the company as an attractive acquisition target for one of the major enterprise software platforms. The board asked reasonable questions about execution risk, sales productivity assumptions, and customer success capacity to support larger implementations, and Trevor addressed each question with confidence, explaining that he had built detailed models showing that the increased investment would generate returns within 6 quarters and that the operational infrastructure was ready to support the growth. I listened to this presentation knowing that almost every assumption Trevor was making was wrong, that the operational infrastructure was not ready for this kind of growth, that the sales productivity numbers he was citing were based on channel deals that had artificially inflated the pipeline without generating real customer demand. I did not challenge Trevor's presentation during the board meeting because I understood that doing so would be framed as resistance to growth, as operational conservatism standing in the way of strategic vision, and that the board was already predisposed to believe Trevor's narrative over my concerns. But after the meeting ended and the board members were leaving, I asked the audit committee chair, a woman named Linda Henshaw who had been a CFO at several public companies and who I knew valued operational rigor, whether she had 15 minutes to discuss some of the execution assumptions underlying the growth plan. Linda agreed, and we sat in a side office while I walked through 3 specific concerns. The sales productivity assumptions were based on deals that had not yet converted to implemented customers. The customer success organization was already operating at capacity with current implementation volumes, and the technology platform had scalability constraints that would require significant engineering investment before it could support the larger enterprise deployments Trevor was targeting. I did not frame these as reasons to reject the growth plan but as execution risks that needed to be addressed in the planning process, and I suggested that the board might want to request a detailed operational readiness assessment before approving the level of investment Trevor was proposing. Linda listened carefully, took notes, and asked several follow-up questions about the specific constraints I had identified, and then she said she would raise these concerns with the full board and request that Trevor provide additional detail on operational readiness in the next board meeting. Trevor found out about my conversation with Linda within 24 hours and he called me into his office the following morning and closed the door. He did not sit down. He stood behind his desk and told me that I had undermined his credibility with the board, that going around him to board members with operational concerns was insubordinate and inappropriate, and that if I had concerns about his strategy, I should have raised them with him privately rather than creating doubt in the minds of directors who were not equipped to evaluate operational details. He said the company needed aligned executive leadership, that the board had hired him to drive growth and that my role was to enable that growth rather than question it, and that if I could not support his vision then perhaps it was time for us to discuss whether Pinnacle was still the right place for me. The threat was clear: align with his narrative or leave. I told him I understood his concern, that my intention had been to ensure operational readiness rather than to undermine his strategy, and that I would be more mindful about how I communicated concerns in the future. Then I left his office and went back to my desk and I began building a file. The file was not revenge, it was documentation. Over the next 6 weeks, I systematically compiled evidence of the operational risks Trevor was creating through his growth strategy, the gaps between his public representations and the actual state of operational readiness, and the specific decisions he had made that were likely to result in customer failures and financial underperformance. I pulled data from the customer success ticketing system showing that implementation timelines were already extending beyond contracted schedules, that customer satisfaction scores had declined over the previous 2 quarters, and that the renewal rate for customers who had been sold in the aggressive expansion Trevor had initiated was 11 percentage points lower than the historical average. I analyzed the sales pipeline he had been presenting to the board and identified that 42% of the forecasted deals were in accounts that had been unresponsive to outreach for over 60 days, suggesting that the pipeline was inflated with opportunities that would never close. I reviewed the product roadmap and documented that the enterprise features Trevor was promising to large customers did not exist in the current platform and would require at least 9 months of engineering work to build, meaning that deals being closed now were being sold on capabilities that could not be delivered within the timeframes customers expected. And I collected emails and meeting notes showing that I had raised these concerns with Trevor multiple times, that he had dismissed them as operational pessimism, and that he had explicitly instructed teams to prioritize growth metrics over customer success metrics because revenue growth was what the board cared about and what would drive the company's valuation. I did not share this file with anyone initially because I knew that presenting it while Trevor was still in control of the narrative would simply accelerate my departure without changing the board's trajectory. Instead, I waited for the inevitable failure to materialize, and I watched as the operational problems I had predicted began to compound. 3 large enterprise deals that Trevor had personally closed in his first 4 months hit implementation failures, when the customers discovered that the platform could not handle their data volumes and integration requirements. And 2 of those customers initiated formal contract disputes, claiming that Pinnacle had misrepresented product capabilities during the sales process. The customer success organization, stretched beyond capacity by the volume of new implementations, began missing service-level commitments, and the Net Promoter Score that Pinnacle had maintained in the mid-60s for 3 years dropped to 41 in a single quarter. The renewal rate for the cohort of customers acquired during Trevor's tenure fell to 63%, 17 points below the company average, and the revenue churn from these failed renewals began to offset the new bookings Trevor was generating, creating a situation where the company was running faster just to stay in place. And the sales team, incentivized to close deals regardless of fit or deliverability, began generating implementation commitments that the professional services team could not fulfill, leading to project delays, cost overruns, and margin erosion that turned what should have been profitable customer engagements into money-losing operational nightmares. Trevor's response to these operational failures was to blame execution rather than strategy, to argue that the growth plan was sound, but that operational teams were not executing with the speed and quality required to support it, and to push for even more aggressive growth to compensate for the churn that was now threatening the revenue trajectory he had promised. He restructured the customer success organization, replacing the VP who had been building sustainable implementation processes with someone from his previous company who believed in high-velocity delivery and accepted that some customer failures were inevitable in a growth-focused strategy. He pressured the engineering team to release enterprise features before they were fully tested, accepting technical debt and quality issues as acceptable trade-offs for being able to close larger deals. And he continued to present optimistic forecasts to the board, showing revenue growth curves that assumed the operational problems were temporary execution issues that would be resolved through better management rather than systemic consequences of a fundamentally flawed strategy. I watched this unfold with a mixture of professional detachment and cold certainty, knowing that the operational reality would eventually become impossible to hide, and that when it did, the board would need to understand why it had happened and who had warned them. The crisis came in early December when one of Pinnacle's largest customers, a Fortune 500 manufacturing company that represented 8% of annual revenue, sent a formal letter to the board notifying them that they were terminating their contract for cause due to persistent platform failures, missed service commitments, and misrepresentation of product capabilities during the sales process. The letter was detailed, professional, and devastating, documenting specific promises that had been made during the sales process, specific failures in product performance and implementation support, and specific communications where Pinnacle's account team had acknowledged problems but failed to resolve them. The board received this letter directly because the customer's general counsel had sent it to Pinnacle's board chair with a copy to Trevor, and it triggered an emergency board meeting where Trevor was asked to explain how a customer relationship representing 8% of revenue had deteriorated to the point of contract termination and potential litigation, without the board having been informed that there were serious problems. Trevor attempted to frame the situation as an isolated incident involving a difficult customer with unrealistic expectations, but the board was not satisfied with that explanation, and they asked for a comprehensive review of customer health metrics, implementation performance, and renewal rates across the entire customer base. The operational review took 2 weeks and was conducted by the audit committee with support from an external consulting firm that specialized in SaaS operational assessments, and I was asked to participate in the review and provide full access to operational data, customer success metrics, implementation timelines, and any communications related to operational concerns I had raised with executive leadership. I provided everything I had compiled, including the file I had been building since September that documented the pattern of operational warnings I had given Trevor, his dismissals of those warnings, and the predictive accuracy of the concerns I had raised about sales productivity, customer success capacity, and product readiness. The consulting firm interviewed customers, sales team members, customer success managers, and product engineers, and they found a systematic pattern where revenue growth was being prioritized over customer success, where sales commitments were being made without operational verification that they could be delivered. The firm's report concluded that Pinnacle was at significant risk of a customer success crisis that could result in accelerating churn, brand damage, and potential legal liability, and that addressing this crisis would require fundamental changes to sales practices, product positioning, implementation processes, and executive leadership accountability. The board meeting where this report was presented occurred on a Friday afternoon in mid-January, and Trevor was asked to present his plan for addressing the operational issues the audit had identified. He presented a restructuring proposal that involved hiring additional customer success staff, implementing new quality control processes, and revising sales compensation to include customer success metrics. But the board's questions focused less on his remediation plan and more on why he had not addressed these issues earlier, why he had dismissed operational concerns that had been raised by the COO. Trevor attempted to defend his decisions by arguing that growth required accepting some operational risk, that the customer failures were unfortunate but represented a small percentage of the overall customer base, and that operational concerns had to be balanced against strategic opportunities or the company would become conservative and slow-moving. Linda Henshaw, the audit committee chair, asked him directly whether he had been aware of the operational concerns I had raised in September, whether he had investigated those concerns before dismissing them, and whether he believed his growth strategy had been based on accurate assessments of operational readiness. Trevor acknowledged that I had raised concerns but said he had evaluated them and determined they were overstated, that operational leaders often resist growth strategies because they focus on constraints rather than possibilities, and that his judgment had been that the company needed to push through operational growing pains rather than slow down to perfect processes. Linda then asked me to present my perspective on the operational situation, and I walked the board through the analysis I had compiled showing the correlation between Trevor's aggressive growth initiatives and the deterioration in customer success metrics, the specific warnings I had provided about sales productivity assumptions and product readiness gaps. I did not editorialize or make it personal. I simply presented the data, the warnings, the dismissals, and the outcomes, and I let the board draw their own conclusions about whether the operational crisis we were facing was the result of unavoidable growing pains or preventable strategic failures that had occurred because operational reality had been subordinated to growth narratives. The room was silent when I finished, and the board chair thanked me for the analysis and said the board would need time to discuss the situation in executive session. Trevor and I were both asked to leave the room, and I went back to my office knowing that the next few hours would determine whether I still had a future at the company I had helped build. The board's executive session lasted 3 hours, and I received a call at 7 p.m. from the board chair asking me to return to the office for a conversation. When I arrived, Trevor was not there. The board chair, Linda Henshaw, and one other independent director were waiting in the conference room, and they asked me to sit down. The chair explained that the board had made the decision to remove Trevor as CEO effective immediately, that they had concluded his leadership had created operational risks that threatened the company's long-term viability, and that his dismissal of operational concerns had reflected a fundamental misalignment between his growth-focused approach and the operational discipline the company required. They asked me whether I would be willing to serve as interim CEO while they conducted a search for permanent leadership, and they acknowledged that I had been systematically excluded from decision-making over the previous 6 months, but that the operational review had demonstrated that my judgment about the company's operational readiness had been accurate, and that the board needed leadership that would prioritize sustainable execution over aggressive growth narratives. I told them I would accept the interim CEO role on the condition that I had full authority to restructure operations, reset customer commitments to align with actual capabilities, and rebuild the executive team with leaders who understood that revenue growth without operational excellence was not growth but borrowed time. They agreed to all of my conditions. I spent the next 9 months as interim CEO rebuilding what Trevor had broken, and the work was methodical, unglamorous, and focused entirely on operational fundamentals rather than strategic vision. I renegotiated commitments with the customers whose implementations had failed, offering service credits and timeline extensions in exchange for keeping their business and giving us the opportunity to deliver on our original promises. I restructured the sales organization to require operational sign-off on enterprise deals before contracts could be executed, ensuring that we stopped selling capabilities we could not deliver. I invested in platform scalability and enterprise features that would allow us to actually support the large customers Trevor had targeted, but I did so in a phased approach that aligned product development with customer commitments rather than making promises first and scrambling to build capabilities later. And I rebuilt trust with the customer success organization by making it clear that implementation quality mattered more than revenue growth, that we would measure success by customer outcomes rather than bookings velocity, and that no one would be rewarded for growth that generated churn. The financial results during this period were not impressive by venture capital standards. Revenue growth slowed to single digits, some quarters were flat, and we lost a few customers who were too damaged by their initial experience to give us another chance, but the operational metrics told a different story. Implementation success rates improved, customer satisfaction scores recovered, and the renewal rate for customers in their second and third years climbed back to historical levels, rebuilding the foundation of sustainable growth that Trevor's strategy had undermined. The board conducted a formal CEO search and ultimately offered me the permanent role, which I accepted with the understanding that I would continue to prioritize operational excellence over growth narratives, and that the board would support a strategy focused on sustainable customer success rather than aggressive expansion. Trevor's departure was characterized in the press as a mutual decision to pursue other opportunities, and I never publicly discussed the operational crisis that had led to his removal, because there was no value in damaging his reputation, and because the company's focus needed to be on moving forward rather than relitigating past failures. I heard through industry contacts that he had taken a CEO role at a smaller startup where his growth-oriented approach was more aligned with early-stage expectations, and I hoped for the sake of that company's employees and customers that he had learned something from his experience at Pinnacle, though I suspected he had not. The principle that had been tested and validated through this experience was not about revenge or personal vindication, but about the fundamental tension in corporate leadership between vision and execution, between growth narratives and operational reality, and about what happens when leaders prioritize their own credibility over acknowledging the constraints that determine whether strategies will actually work. Trevor had cut me out of every meeting because he understood that my presence would introduce operational questions that would complicate his growth narrative, and he had been correct about that calculation. My questions would have complicated his narrative, because his narrative was built on assumptions that did not align with operational reality. The board called me back not because they suddenly recognized my strategic vision, but because operational reality eventually asserts itself regardless of how compelling the narrative is, and when it does, Organizations need leaders who understand the difference between what sounds good in a presentation and what actually works when you try to execute it. That difference is not dramatic or cinematic, but it is the difference between companies that build sustainable value and companies that generate short-term growth followed by long-term crisis. And it is the difference that ultimately determines who gets called back when the board realizes they need to fix what they broke.